The elevator hummed quietly as it climbed to the 15th floor. Frank Lucas stood alone in the mirrored box, adjusting his cufflinks with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. His reflection stared back, a man who had built an empire from nothing, who had survived wars with the Italian families, who had turned Harlem into his personal kingdom. But tonight, Frank knew he was walking into a trap. The doors slid open with a soft chime. The hallway stretched before him, empty except for the faint scent of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic that made his nostrils flare slightly. Fear had a smell. So did desperation. At the end of the hall, apartment 15C waited. Behind that door, Tony Marchetti and 6 of his crew were preparing for what they believed would be Frank's final meeting. Frank had known Tony since the kid was running numbers in Queens. 28 years old, hungry, reckless. The type of man who mistook ambition for intelligence, who thought respect could be taken instead of earned. 3 days ago, Frank's sources had revealed Tony's plan. The young crew leader had been spreading word on the streets. Frank Lucas was finished. Too old, too careful, too out of touch. It was time for fresh blood to take control. The execution was simple. Invite Frank to discuss a business opportunity. Wait until he was comfortable. Then put 3 bullets in his chest and dump the body where it would send a message. But Frank Lucas hadn't survived 40 years in this business by being predictable. He knocked twice on the door. Soft, polite knocks, the kind a neighbor might make when returning borrowed sugar. Heavy footsteps approached from inside. The door opened to reveal Sal, Tony's lieutenant, 6'2", built like a refrigerator, with dead eyes that had seen too much violence. "Mr. Lucas," Sal stepped aside, his hand hovering near his waistband. "Tony's waiting for you." Frank nodded and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly what he'd expected. Expensive furniture arranged without taste, abstract paintings chosen for their price tags rather than beauty, crystal decanters filled with whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Tony sat behind a mahogany desk that dominated the living room. His dark hair was slicked back with too much gel, his suit pressed to razor sharpness. He looked like money, but Frank could see the nervousness beneath the polish. Around the room, 6 men tried to look casual. 2 by the windows, 1 near the kitchen doorway, another by the bookshelf. All armed, all watching Frank with the intensity of hunters studying their prey. "Frank," Tony stood, extending his hand with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Thanks for coming. Can I offer you a drink?" "Cognac," Frank said quietly, settling into the chair across from Tony's desk. "Hennessy, if you have it." Tony nodded to one of his men, who poured the amber liquid into a crystal glass. Frank accepted it, but didn't drink. Instead, he held the glass between his hands, feeling its weight. "You wanted to discuss an opportunity," Frank said, his voice calm as still water. "That's right." Tony returned to his seat, leaning back with manufactured confidence. "See, Frank, times are changing. The old ways, they don't work anymore. People want new leadership, younger leadership." Frank's face remained expressionless. "Is that what people want?" "It is." Tony's voice gained strength from his crew's presence. "Nothing personal, but your time is over. This neighborhood needs someone who understands the modern game." Frank took a slow sip of his cognac, then set the glass down with deliberate care. "And you think you understand the modern game?" "I know I do." Tony's hand moved to rest on the desk drawer. Frank knew what was inside. "Which brings me to my offer." "I'm listening." Tony's smile widened. You retire. Tonight. Walk away from your operations, your territory, your contacts. In return, I let you live. You get to spend your golden years in Florida or wherever old bosses go to die. The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic 15 floors below. Frank could feel 6 sets of eyes watching him, waiting for his reaction. Instead of anger or fear, Frank felt something unexpected. Disappointment. Tony, he said finally, may I ask you a question? Sure. How many buildings do you own in this neighborhood? The question seemed to catch Tony off guard. What? Buildings, real estate, property, how many do you own? Tony's brow furrowed. I don't see how that's… Humor me. 2, Tony said. I own 2 buildings. Frank nodded slowly. And how many businesses pay you protection money? 15, maybe 20? What's your point? My point, Frank said, is that you don't understand the first thing about power. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Tony's hand moved closer to the drawer handle. You think power comes from fear? Frank continued, his voice still conversational. You think if you kill me, if you put a bullet in my head, that automatically makes you the boss. But that's not how this works. Then how does it work? Tony's voice carried an edge now. Frank stood slowly, ignoring the way every man in the room tensed. He walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Power, he said, is about understanding people, their needs, their fears, their dreams. Power is about being indispensable. He turned back to face Tony. Tell me, when you decided to kill me tonight, what did you tell your crew? Tony's jaw tightened. That's none of your… You told them there would be a war, Frank interrupted. You told them the other families would try to move in. You told them they'd have to fight for every block, every business, every dollar. Tony said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. And what did you promise them in return for that war? More money, better territory. Frank shook his head. You promised them blood and uncertainty. You know what I promise people, Tony? He walked back to his chair but remained standing. I promised them stability. I promised them that their children can walk to school without worrying about crossfire. I promised them that their businesses will thrive because the neighborhood is safe. That's weakness, Tony snarled. That's why, Frank said. Your own men called me 3 days ago. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Tony's face went white. Around the room, Frank could see confusion spreading among the crew like a contagion. That's impossible, Tony whispered. Frank reached into his jacket pocket. Every gun in the room swung toward him, but he moved slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a small digital recording device and placed it on the desk. Sal, Frank said, would you like to hear yourself explaining Tony's plan to my associates? The giant by the door went rigid. His hand, which had been reaching for his weapon, froze in place. Frank pressed play. Sal's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. Tony wants to take out Frank Lucas tomorrow night. Says it's time for new blood. Wants me to set up the meeting. Make sure Frank comes alone. Tony spun to face his lieutenant. Sal, what the hell? There's more, Frank said, pressing another button. A different voice now, younger. I don't know, man. Frank's always been straight with us. Tony's promising big money, but Frank delivers. And another. My cousin works for Frank's crew in the Bronx. Says they get regular pay, good benefits, respect. Tony treats us like expendable soldiers. Frank clicked off the recording. The silence that followed was deafening. You see, Tony, you made a fundamental error. You assumed loyalty could be bought with promises. But my people, they've seen what I deliver. They've lived under my protection. They know the difference between a leader and a pretender. Tony's hand was shaking now as it hovered over the drawer. You turned my own crew? I didn't turn anyone, Frank said calmly. I simply offered them what you never could. Certainty. A future where they don't have to look over their shoulders every day, wondering if their boss's ego is going to get them killed. Frank walked around the desk until he stood directly in front of Tony. The young man's breathing was rapid, shallow. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Here's what's going to happen, Frank said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You're going to stand up. You're going to walk to that window, and you're going to tell me exactly how much you owe in gambling debts to the Torino family. Tony's eyes went wide. How did you... $340,000, Frank answered his own question. Due next Friday, with interest accumulating at 5% per day. Around the room, Frank could see the crew members exchanging glances. This was news to them. Their fearless leader, the man promising them a brighter future, was in debt to their enemies. You were going to use my death to solve your financial problems, Frank continued. Kill me, take over my operations, use the profits to pay off your debts. Clean and simple. Tony tried to speak, but only a strangled sound escaped his throat. But here's what you didn't consider, Frank said. The Torinos don't want your money. They want my territory. You're not their partner, Tony. You're their weapon. And once a weapon has served its purpose. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Frank turned to address the crew. Gentlemen, you have a choice. You can continue following a dead man walking, or you can work for an organization that values your lives. Sal was the first to move. The giant walked over to Tony's desk, opened the drawer, and removed the pistol inside. Without a word, he ejected the clip and handed both pieces to Frank. One by one, the others followed suit. Weapons were disarmed, placed on the coffee table like offerings at an altar. Tony watched his empire crumble in real time, his crew abandoning him without a single shot being fired. This building, Frank said, settling into Tony's chair, is now under my protection. The businesses you were collecting from will continue paying, but to my organization. Your debts to the Torinos become my responsibility to resolve. He opened Tony's laptop, which sat on the desk, and began typing. I'm transferring ownership of your 2 buildings to an LLC controlled by my people. Consider it compensation.